It is late May in 2012, and a village is preparing for a big event. Over the coming Springbank holiday weekend, the whole country will be celebrating Queen Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, and Standlake will be no exception. So a community has come together, and there is work to be done. Today, in the early part of the 21st century, Standlake is a thriving and attractive West Oxfordshire village. But like most of the villages in England, it has been shaped over many centuries by its geography, the industry and enterprise of its citizens, and the influence of social and industrial change in the outside world. The roots of Standlake go way back beyond the origins of nationhood, but for our purposes, the history of the last 1,000 years will do very well. It's an interesting story, not least because it explains so much about the village we know and love today. There is still evidence of Bronze Age, Iron Age and Romano-British settlement in the area. But by Anglo-Saxon times, the hamlets of Brighthampton and Standlake existed on the fringes of the royal estate of Bampton. The name Standlake actually dates from the 11th century and means stream by the stones, reflecting the situation of the village, low-lying and close to the standing stones of Stanton Harcourt. Over the centuries, its proximity to water has proved to be both threat and opportunity, in that the village has always been prone to seasonal flooding, but has also benefited from the siting of watermills along the Windrush. We can only imagine the devastation that flooding would have brought to a tiny hamlet of fragile homes some 100 years ago, but memories are still fresh of the last major deluge in 2007, reported here by the BBC.
You can see everybody now, they're waiting for the sandbags to arrive. The RAF and the Army are going to be dropping them off soon. The County Council has said that they've dropped off enough sand for today. They're bringing the pre-bagged stuff, so these people will be carrying it off home, building it up outside their homes, outside their doors, and hoping that the water levels don't rise too much.
But in the end, it was the floods that made the decision. Virtually everybody in this nursing home moved away for their own safety. Here, hundreds of lives continue to be affected by the rising waters that are not expected to peak until the early hours. Richard Bilton, BBC News, Oxfordshire.
By Norman times, the hamlets of Standlake and Brighthampton, with Brittenton, formed the estate of the Lord of Brighthampton, Anscombe de Grey. And in 1086, the Domesday Book records that it had 37 villagers and 5 slaves. But unusually for the times, it was a female descendant of Anscombe, Lady Eva de Grey, who had the biggest influence on village development. She left 4 daughters and no male heir to inherit the manor. The first documentary evidence of a church in the village was when Lady Eva presented its first rector, John de Limasea, in 1228, a date which was commemorated 750 years later with Joan Goadby's book, 1228 and All That. A church certainly existed in the village prior to 1228, and by 1250, St Giles would have been very recognisable to modern eyes. Linda Blair takes up the story.
As you enter St Giles Church, the impression is of a lovely, serene and peaceful space. The basic structure of the building is clearly medieval, but its present internal appearance owes much to the Victorian restoration carried out between 1880 and 1892 by the architect Clapton Rolfe. The original church was probably built around the year 1180 by the de Grey family, the local landowners. Very little remains from this time except the capitals of the chancel arch, a blocked Norman doorway in the north wall of the chancel, and buttresses at the west end of the nave. Lady Eva de Grey, who presented the first recorded rector in 1228, rebuilt the church, enlarging the chancel and transepts. The early English lancet windows of this time can still be seen in the chancel. Like many churches in this area, St Giles was remodelled and embellished during the booming wool trade years of the 13th and 14th centuries. The aisles and arcades of the long nave, with 4 arches on each side, date from this time. Those to the south, with round pillars, were built first, and the north arcade, with octagonal pillars, slightly later. The arch from the north aisle to the transept rests on heads, one of a lady with a net over her hair, and the other of a man in a cowl. There would have been no pews at this time, only stone benches by the wall for the weakest, and the space, the largest in the village, would have been used for many activities. During the 15th century, the clerestory was added to give height and allow more light into the church, and the roof pitch was lowered to a more fashionable level, as can be seen from the freestanding gable at the eastern end of the roof and the mouldings on the tower. The distinctive octagonal tower was added in the 14th century and has traces of an old sundial on the south face. The belfry houses a ring of 6 bells, the oldest 3 dating from around 1709.
By 1246, the rectory was on its site by the Windrush. This fine building, much altered and extended over the years, remained a rectory until 1980, when it was sold. The old rectory, as it has been renamed, is now in private hands. In contrast, a manor house, which was built on the opposite side of the Windrush from St Giles, close to the rectory, is long gone, although this aerial view clearly shows the site and plan of the building. After Lady Eva's death, manorial land was divided and later sold, much to Oxford colleges, principally Magdalen, Lincoln and Brasenose. Magdalen had the largest share and effectively became lord of the manor, administering the manor court. House names such as Magdalen Farm Cottage, Lincoln Farmhouse and Lincoln House are evidence of college influence. Farming has always been important, and during the 13th and 14th centuries, the population of the village grew steadily into a community that was largely self-sufficient. It grew its own food and provided its own services, including the holding of a weekly market in the wide high street. There were 3 water mills along the Windrush, which were all grist type, used for flour production. Very necessary, as bread was an essential part of the diet. Although all have now ceased production, Church Mill was renovated in the late 20th century. Leon Goldstone tells us more.
Church Mill is now really the only one with the machinery still intact. There is a mill mentioned in the Domesday Book of a mill in the manor of Brighthampton, and as Brighthampton superseded Standlake, there is a possibility that this is the mill that was mentioned in the Domesday Book. Now that is about the speed when we're actually milling wheat. That is the speed, and most of what you see here is 19th century. And we do get some very interesting things coming down the Windrush. We've had school desks, we've had 20-foot of rigid piping, we've had dinghies, all sorts of things get thrown into the river, and we've even had a dead sheep.
In medieval times, the Cotswold woolen industry, illustrated here in its Victorian heyday, was substantial and prosperous, and the nearby market town of Witney became an important centre. Most of the villages surrounding Witney became involved in sub-manufacturing, and Standlake was no exception. Rack End runs parallel to the River Windrush and takes its name from the wooden racks that were used to stretch washed woolen products. These products were secured to the racks by tenterhooks, giving birth to the expression to be on tenterhooks. One successful woolen trader has a fine bale tomb in St Giles churchyard, complete with a characteristic carved woolsack surmounting it. Standlake Manor, although not a manor house in the traditional sense, was built around 1350. It is a fine building, with a medieval fireplace and late 15th century ceiling bosses. It has a colourful history up to the 20th century, when it served as the Standlake Home Guard HQ during the Second World War, and later as a mink farm. Today, much of its land has been given over to a housing development, now Manor Crescent. Similarly, Lincoln Farm House is a medieval survivor, with most of its land taken over by a residential and holiday caravan park and leisure centre. Further opportunities for development came with the construction of Newbridge over the Thames in the 13th century. Then, in the Tudor period, a causeway was built to ease passage across the floodplain from Newbridge to the village. Standlake's inns benefited from the causeway as the number of travellers increased significantly. Today, only 2 survive. The Black Horse has occupied its current building on the High Street since 1673. And the Bell moved from Rack End to its High Street site sometime between 1792 and 1804. The Golden Balls in Brighthampton was the venue for many social events over the years, and the starting point for village outings. It was demolished and rebuilt in the early part of the 20th century, then finally closed and again pulled down to make way for housing in 1992. Next to the Golden Balls is Florrie's farmhouse, which dates from the early 17th century. Other well-known houses in the village were also built around this time. In the 17th century, Gaunt House, on the edge of Standlake, was purchased and restored by Samuel Fell, the Dean of Christ Church, Oxford. During the Civil War, it was garrisoned for King Charles I, as it was conveniently close to the strategically important Thames crossing, where a royalist garrison was billeted. And in 1644 fought and won the Battle of Newbridge. In June 1645, Parliamentary forces attacked Gaunt House, and after a 2 or 3 day siege, they gained possession. One source said 800 men, foot and artillery had been set against the lonely little house in the meadows. Evidence of this turbulent time can be seen in the front door, which still has the holes put there with a deadly purpose, to allow defenders to train their guns on the enemy. Nick Clack, who was born there in 1930, shares a few memories.
I was born at Gaunt House on the 17th of August 1930 during the depth of the last severe depression. My parents farmed it with 200 acres from 1928 to 1962. Throughout the 1930s, coping with the depression, we would have our being at Gaunt House almost entirely in the kitchen and the scullery to save the expense of keeping such a large place presentable and warm. Every animal had to earn its keep, and ours. Chickens and ducks were wholly free range, and my father would regularly drive to and park in Oxford to sell eggs and garden produce in the market to supplement the main farm income.
Every Ascension Day, the village children attend a special service in the church and receive little loaves. This is because in 1657, Thomas Wheel of Underdown Mill died and left 6 acres of land to provide loaves of bread for the poor of the parish on Ascension Day. Over 350 years later, the children of Standlake still receive little loaves. And here are this year's happy recipients, receiving theirs from the rector. Many small cottages were built during the 19th century as the population expanded more rapidly. There were 911 villagers in the 1851 census. In consequence, overcrowding became severe and new building was essential. Today, about 1,450 people live in the village. Farming was becoming more mechanised in the Victorian age. In 1853, open fields became enclosed, including common land which was largely turned over to arable cultivation. A recreation ground and 10 acres for allotments were developed on land given by Magdalen College. Both of these are well used to this day. And in 1847, the first church school was opened, and the thriving community that is Standlake Church of England Primary School today is a source of great pride to the village, taking children from 3 years old. The mid-19th century was still a period when villages such as Standlake were still, by and large, self-supporting, providing villagers' needs. One statistic is interesting. The 1851 census tells us that there were no fewer than 19 shoemakers living and working in the village. In the 1860s, a post office opened in Swift Cottage on the Green. It is now in the village shop, and by this time Standlake also had its own police constable. Transport too was changing, and by 1847 2 carriers, of people as well as goods, were in business. In due course 2 further operators, Daniel Florey and James Douglas, joined them, and regular services to Witney were established. The cost? The equivalent of 1 new penny. For trips to Oxford, the route involved crossing the Thames by ferry at Bablock Hythe. However, this didn't suit all of the horses all of the time, and sometimes they had to be blindfolded and led onto the boat backwards to avoid panic. 1876 saw the arrival of an important figure in the history of Standlake. The Reverend Lewis Tuckwell of Magdalen College was appointed rector of St Giles, and he quickly threw himself enthusiastically and skillfully into the life of the community. As a keen chorister himself, Tuckwell formed a fine choir, and soon found his congregation increasing. He also founded a club for handbell ringers and a parish magazine. However, his most important legacy is his rescue of St Giles itself, literally saving it from ruin. On his death, he chose to be buried in the churchyard. Linda Blair now shows us Tuckwell's restoration and more recent changes.
Tuckwell was a man of huge energy, and he set about a major restoration. The entire church was re-roofed, the walls repointed, the windows restored, the floors replaced, and the porch rebuilt. The south transept became a baptistry, and a new font with a richly carved canopy built on a counterbalanced system of weights was erected. The old Norman tub font disappeared, possibly buried beneath the new one, as often happened. Good quality oak is everywhere, beautifully carved by Harry Hems of Exeter. The 8 angel musicians on the chancel roof reflect Tuckwell's love of music. The nave roof has 10 angels with shields representing the emblems of the Passion. The chancel stalls show the apostles, the pulpit has the evangelists, and the nave pew ends the 32 saints of the English calendar. The men on the south, led by St Giles, women on the north, led by Mary, the mother of Jesus. Sadly, some things were lost in the restoration. The rood loft above the chancel arch was dismantled, although the staircase remains with its upper and lower doors. All medieval glass disappeared except for a small fragment in the south transept, not in its original position. Tuckwell admired the early English style with its pointed arches, so he blocked the old Norman door in the north wall of the chancel, the shape of which can still be seen. We might decry what was lost, but Tuckwell certainly saved the church from further decay, and the work done was of high quality. More recently, further restoration and adaptations have been carried out as the church evolves to meet present needs, just as it did in the past.
One notable event during the 19th century was the foundation of a parish council, following an Act of Parliament in 1894. The council has made a valuable contribution to the life of the village ever since. Its most recent contribution, with the West Oxfordshire District Council, is to fund a new play area for young children. With the dawning of the 20th century came the Boer War, when 12 village men fought in the army. The First World War saw as many as 96 join the armed forces, 27 of whom were casualties, and there are 19 names recorded on the War Memorial. In 1919, peace was celebrated with village events. At this time, too, an enthusiastic village band, photographed here in 1910, was very popular indeed, though one villager thought it made a dreadful noise. Next to the Black Horse was the Old Village Hall, a former army hut, bought for the sum of £78 in the 1920s. It remained in use until 1989, when the present one was built next to the recreation ground. The village's telephone exchange was already well established by the 1920s at Johnson's Engineering on the High Street. In 1900, there were just 10 subscribers, and the Johnsons continued to run it until 1941, when the system was automated. The Johnsons also provided wheelwright services, very important as horse-drawn transport was still prevalent. The company still thrives under the family's current generation, and is engaged in agricultural and general engineering. Their calendars were always popular. The BBC began broadcasting in 1924, and Standlake soon had its first wireless repair shop. A cycle shop had been flourishing for some years in a shed by Brighthampton House on the Abingdon Road, but now motorised transport was rapidly growing in popularity. The first taxi services began in 1923, and in 1927 Standlake Garage was opened. This is one of the first cars in the village, owned by the Pickfords of Yew Tree Farm. By the 1930s, all public transport in the village was motorised. There was a bus to Oxford and the Smock Farthing bus to Witney. This quaintly named service refers to the fact that it departed from the Smock Farthing tree, a great elm which stood on the edge of the village for 400 years, and which took its name from the farthing chimney tax, the smoke farthing, which was levied for many years. Buses have served the village ever since, of course, although not always without controversy. This letter in response to the Women's Institute is revealing.
Dear Madam, the Roads Committee of my council has considered your letter of the 12th instant regarding the behaviour of persons waiting for the Standlake, Northmoor and Stanton Harcourt buses. The committee has instructed me to communicate with the City of Oxford Motor Services Limited and ask if one of their inspectors will make an investigation of your complaint, with a view to persuading the persons waiting for this bus to queue in a more orderly manner. Yours faithfully, John Welsh, Clerk to the Council.
The Standlake branch of the Institute was founded in 1932, and so now has a proud 80-year history. It has provided enjoyment and fulfilment for members over the years. This photograph shows an early outing to Brighton. The Women's Institute has always been ready to help good causes, and here its members are giving a tea party as part of the Diamond Jubilee celebrations. Florey's Stores, on the High Street, was a focal point by the outbreak of the war in 1939, as the village was no longer as self-supporting as it had once been. Howard Florey, the son of Joseph, who had emigrated to Australia, returned to Oxford in 1921, and later was awarded the Nobel Prize for his role in the development of penicillin. Mr. Lewis Tuckey, the baker, delivered bread twice a day in the village and surrounding area. There were other small shops too, as well as Knipe's Dairy, which also provided a local delivery service. On Abingdon Road was the Forge, which of course was the premises of the blacksmith, but also which sold beer. It was not unheard of for waiting customers to become a little the worse for wear from time to time, and on one sad occasion a drunken brawl led to an accidental death. During the war, Standlake found itself in the middle of an area of intense military activity, with, in particular, several RAF bases nearby, including RAF Bryce Norton. In common with the rest of the country, life was disrupted for many, with men serving in the armed forces, and of course, there was rationing. Gwen Smith struggled to bring up 3 young daughters on her own while her husband was away, while Joan Eagle, now Joan Miles, was a teenager and remembers the war years as ones of fun and excitement. Like so many rural villages, Standlake welcomed evacuees. And in 1939, some 24 children arrived from London and other large cities. In 1940, the 5-year-old Shirley Fay came from London to stay with the Costers, a farming family from Glebe Farm on the Abingdon Road. 72 years later, she is still here, having married farmer Bernard Coster and raised her own family. In all, 59 joined the armed forces, and those that were in reserved occupations joined the Home Guard or became air raid wardens. The Standlake branch of the local Defence Volunteers was set up in 1939 under the command of Sir Henry Chitty, with its headquarters at the Manor. Later, it became more formally established as the fondly remembered Home Guard. In the period 1941-42, Standlake, then a village of fewer than 500 inhabitants, managed to raise £9,392 for war charities, a substantial sum now, but particularly impressive for those times. In 1995, Standlake commemorated 50 years since VE Day, with outdoor events during the day and in the evening a barbecue, followed by a victory dance featuring the music of Glenn Miller and other popular artists of the day. Immediately after the war, life was harder. Most of the remaining college land was sold, farming ceased to be the main employer, and men left the village in search of work elsewhere. The District Council stimulated the development of housing and facilities in Standlake, first building along the Downs Road and in Hayford Close. Later, in the 60s and 70s, Manor Crescent and Woodlands were built, and infill housing and redevelopment has continued to this day. Alongside the housing development, of course, was that of the various utilities. Electricity supplies were introduced over the decade between 1937 and 1947. Mains water in 1957, mains drainage in 1970, and the weekly refuse collection services dates from 1963. In the 1950s, a small medical surgery was opened on the High Street by Dr. Slee, who lived in Standlake Manor, and was later taken over by Dr. Jarvis. It is now a very small private house. Undoubtedly the greatest change to the landscape of the lower Windrush area post-war has been as the result of sand and gravel extracted for road and building construction. These aerial views of the village give a dramatic picture of just how much the surface of the area is now covered in water, following the prolonged workings around Standlake. Some have become lakes to be used as leisure facilities. Older extractions gave us the 3 T's and Hardwick Park water sports and holiday centres, now added to by Lincoln Farm Park and various fishing and wildlife reserves. Following in the tradition of many old Standlake families, the Cantwells, the Johnsons, the Saxells, and the Costers among them, recently founded enterprises flourish alongside them. Software specialists, talented gardeners, builders and decorators, skillful handymen. The list is endless, and we all benefit from their development and success. Penny Coster runs a sandwich making and catering business at Glebe Farm. James French's Land Rover Distribution Company operates from Yew Tree Farm, and the award-winning wine merchant, the Oxford Wine Company, founded by Ted Sandbach, thrives along with many other companies on the industrial estate on the edge of the village. Cricket has been perhaps the favourite village sport of the lower Windrush area for well over 100 years, and the Oxford Downs Club on the Abingdon Road was founded in 1923. In 2002, the club's pavilion was destroyed by a vicious fire, and many trophies and mementos were destroyed. But 2 years later, and with the help of many supporters, a new pitch and pavilion were constructed, and the club continues to thrive. The beautiful mosaics seen around the village remind us of a much-missed resident, Ariana Windle, an inspiring artist who died tragically early. Her teaching of mosaic art, and the work completed by her and her pupils, still adorns the village, most notably in the form of her famous goose, which now stands in the school grounds, and the lovely triptych, 3 panels which are positioned by the Windrush, across the road from St Giles Church. The nature reserve has mosaic signposts showing the way to the hide. Here, Anthony Collieu leads some enthusiastic bird watchers. Many different tastes are catered for, with a large number of clubs and activities, for everyone from toddlers to pensioners. Young people have cubs, brownies and sea scouts, a youth club and the Standlake Ranch Riding School on the Downs. There is also a fine play area and other sports facilities for youngsters on the recreation ground. The Village Tennis Club, founded in 1995 by Shirley Kermode, here shown presenting a junior member with an award, has some superbly equipped courts, and football and badminton are available too. Apart from sports, there is the Historical Society, sponsors of this DVD. For those with green fingers, the Garden Club, and for painters, the Art Group. Singers can join the Lower Windrush Choral Society, which sometimes performs in St Giles Church. Since 2007, the Standlake Players Amateur Drama Group has prospered, offering theatre supper evenings on a regular basis. In 2011, an exhibition of historically significant photographs and documents was mounted in St Giles Church, in conjunction with the Cotswold Churches Festival. It showed how much has been packed into village life in Standlake, and more than 800 people visited in just a few days. It was the obvious interest and enthusiasm shown by those visitors for our village that inspired the production of this DVD. Today, the hamlets of Brighthampton and Brittenton are part of the village of Standlake, and all are bisected by the A415 trunk road that links the neighbouring market towns of Witney and Abingdon. But in spite of the busy flow of traffic every day, Standlake is a beautiful place to live, and the peace of the countryside can be found all around for those who look. Back now to the beginning of June, and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee celebrations are in full swing. Many residents can remember earlier royal occasions, not least the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977. Events like this bring fun and laughter, of course, but they also offer reassurance and comfort for many. Royal anniversaries remind us to value the continuity of our way of life and the community in which we live. Our village existed before the British monarchy, and we have told you something of its story. Now, here's to Her Majesty, and here's to another 1,000 years of the history of Standlake.